today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about sex. And, my name is Jeanne Hoffman. If people hadn't seen me earlier or don't know me from some other place, I'm a psychologist. And I will tell you that when I was in graduate school getting my degree, if somebody told me that I would be talking about sex, bowel, and bladder almost every day, I would have said they were crazy, but that's really what I do, because one of the things that we know is that it's a super important topic. And so that's why I'm talking to you today, and I'm joined by my colleague, Rosemary Buchmeier.
And I'm a nurse, and I've been a nurse for a lot of years, 30 years at Harborview in the rehab clinic and inpatient. And I'm sex-positive person. And last year I wanted to get refreshed and updated and have us hopefully give a presentation on sex and how to foster healthy sexual lives for people after spinal cord injury and any kind of disability, actually. So I'm really pleased to be here.
So our goal today is to do a couple things. One is to just talk about what sexuality is, talk about some of the myths about sexuality and disability, and begin to talk about communication around sex and intimacy. And so, as Rosemary and I were talking about this, we really wanted to think about healthcare providers and individuals with spinal cord injury and partners of people with spinal cord injury, because all of those this is really a universal topic, and certainly one that's important for every individual, but it's also in those combinations are really important as well. And so, to be clear on what we're talking about, if people attended the last hour talk, really talking about sex and sexual function and how do people have sex, is really that piece of it, and your biological identity, are you male or female? But we're really shifting into more of the sexuality side, and sexuality includes, of course, sex, but it also includes all of these other pieces because we're sexual beings. So how you feel, what your behaviors are, how you identify sexually, because of course we know male-female doesn't really capture the many ways that we think about identity, sexual identity. Sexuality includes all of the social and cultural expectations and structures that come from our communities. And so depending on your religion, your political background, your socioeconomic status, your medical background, what kind of disorders you have, all those kind of things really have an interplay with sexuality. It's also very personal and individual, and I think that's something that we all need to be clear on when we're thinking about communication and thinking about talking with others about sexuality and becoming more intimate. Our bottom line in this is that sexual health is key to well-being. And so being able to begin to talk about and communicate with others about it is really important. And I think that's one of our kind of key takeaways, that this is a topic that you should be thinking about and talking about, because it's really everybody, whether it's just by yourself, whether it's with other people, it's an important topic.
There's 2 slides here about myths about sex and people with disabilities. And they're here today because it's super important, as these things are untrue, to bring them up to consciousness. And then what I'd like you to do is dispel them, get rid of them, because they're not true and they're harmful. So our society says people after disability aren't sexual, asexual. So that creates a barrier to love and relationship. And so these false ideas about sex and people with disabilities don't just harm the person with the disability, but it creates an effect on the able-bodied person, that they don't look at a person with a disability as a possible intimate partner, and they don't look at them as a full person. So people are disabled by barriers in society, not necessarily just by their impairment, but these barriers can be caused by attitudes about difference. So these things are actually quite a huge barrier. And we want to have promoted that what's got to happen is intimacy and getting to know people. and dispel these barriers that would eliminate people with disabilities from participating fully and easily in a sexual life. So other people, including healthcare providers, therapists, yourself, you might still have these ideas in mind. So that's why we're showing them today. So I want to talk about a couple of things here, pull some out. One is that people living with disability don't get sexually assaulted, need sex education or protection from that. And that is not true. And there's a very high rate for violence for adults with disabilities. It's 1.5 times the rate for able-bodied people. And this, it's not been well studied for women, but up to 40 to 60% of women report some kind of sexual assault or problem. So this is wrong, and people, of course, need education, protection. And when people enter institutions, the rate of violence and sexual assault goes up. So I wanted to speak to that. And then this idea that real sex is limited to penetration, intercourse, and orgasm, that's fine, but that's so narrow. So masturbation, for example, is a great way for people to experience and learning about their body after spinal cord injury and finding out what will work for them. So in our society, that is discouraged, using masturbation as a form of self-knowledge. So most of us were also raised with extremely negative ideas about this, and so that it's shame-based, and it's hard for them to talk about it or bring it up as an aspect. So we need to move on, and these myths need to be dispelled. The true truth is disability does not mean you're asexual. We're all sexual beings. There's a wide range of things that people can explore to have a sensual, sexual, satisfying experience with their body. And this is a normal part of life, so we want to get into helping people get to their kind of sex. In the past, what got started after the Vietnam War was, and actually even after World War II, was vets pushing for rights. And then Dr. Ted and Sandra Cole, they created sexual attitude reassessment and restructuring education. And they went around, this is a training program, to get medical professionals to be able to talk to people about sex after disability. They made one of these, they were called SAR, the acronym, for disabled patients, and went around the country and started trying to educate people about what was known then. So what we see is, it might not be the first concern that patients have after their spinal cord injury, but most people are interested and are embarrassed to initiate this. So, and rehab stays are so short that I've heard that there's some places where you can actually have a private place and intimacy, but the real truth is it has to be addressed after discharge. And ongoingly, people need to be given permission to talk about it. Thanks, Jeannie.
So we're switching back and forth here. So I think the other piece about this is that we often forget about, that stereotypes about disability and sexuality are held by people with disability as well as by others. However, there's also concerns about the changes that have happened in a partner or someone else where they might feel like they're not as attracted to the person. There's also that idea about like maybe something has changed in their brain, something's different about them. And of course, because all of the role changes that sometimes happen in relationships when somebody has become injured can lead to tension that actually affects people's libido, their interest, their arousal. And one of the topics that often comes up when I talk to people who have not yet re-engaged with sex with their partner is there's often a fear about hurting them because this person now doesn't have sensation or now is now in some ways viewed as being more fragile. And so I think it's very important that all of these things be able to be kind of come out and be discussed. We always try to bring this topic up early, but it doesn't always, again, as Rosemary mentioned, like sometimes early is not the time, and people may have heard it, but it kind of goes in one ear. I mean, it's like, drinking from the fire hose when you're first initially injured, and so it's hard to take in all that information early on. The other thing that I think that we forget about is that there's a lot of reasons and a lot of things that go on in our lives that can lead to changes in your interest and your ability to think about sex and sexual function or sexuality even, and feeling like you're a sexual being. And, this is quite a laundry list of things. And, the reality is that these are all very common in individuals after spinal cord injury. There's a lot of changes that happen. However, these also happen in everyone. These are common problems in any population, and so these are issues that really need to come into play. We often forget about the issues about sexual dysfunction. So the changes that you have due to medical conditions, as well as some of these other conditions, you can actually lose the ability to have lubrication for women, achieve orgasm. For men, having erectile dysfunction and premature ejaculation, much less not being able to, even with sexual stimulation, change our thoughts about fertility as well as interest. And then, of course, all of these, that lack of interest or desire or pain can definitely be huge issues. The reality is, though, is that when we talk about sexual adjustment after spinal cord injury, the research that has been done has definitely largely been on men, and honestly, it's been more on how do you get this done? How do you have sex, right? How do you deal with mobility challenges? How do you deal with sensation challenges? How do you manage things? How do you get an erection? How do you manage bowel and bladder? And while those are super important to talk about and discuss, they don't necessarily all get addressed on the things that really need to be talked about as well. And those are things like, how is your mood and how are you feeling about your body and your body image? How are you managing the role changes in your relationship to even add sex and intimacy back into that? How do you manage all that change, the stressors that are happening in your life, much less your confidence if you don't have a partner, given all the other things that are going on, thinking about being a sexual being and having you wanting to gain intimacy with other people.
So we know sex is a process of communication that includes both talking and listening. But talking about sex is difficult for most people, even before the spinal cord injury, and it certainly doesn't get easier after. So initiating conversation about my needs, and desires could be really uncomfortable, and it's vulnerable. So you have to develop some skill, because how else could you get what you want and what you are longing for? And how are you going to learn about what your partner desires or what they're afraid of that could be inhibiting in getting going some good sexual experiences? So increasing intimacy skills really has to start with some self-acceptance, giving yourself permission to explore new things, open up your mind. So you might consider making 2 or more lists, and one I'd recommend for anybody is you need to write down what you need to know and how you're going to be able to do. Let me start again. What you need to know or do to be comfortable and feel safe initiating this conversation about sex with someone you're attracted to. And you can write that down and then practice saying it out loud, and then try to catch what you're thinking when you do that. Is it neutral, positive or negative, because this will help you see what you might need to practice and work on or have some help. If things are really negative, rehab psychology is really helpful, and there's some self-help or books that I put over there where you can go through things at home on your own and work on stuff so that you feel safe and comfortable initiating conversation with somebody you're interested in. And the other list would be what makes you nervous and anxious about talking about sex. Just write it out. And again, say it out loud and see what you're thinking, because this self-learning is really important to get things going.
So when we were starting to talk about putting this talk together, of really thinking about how do you begin to have these conversations, like I think we were really getting down to what are the skills, what are the basics, how can you do this? We really thought about, you need to match the person that you're talking to. Are you talking to a partner? Are you talking to a healthcare provider? Are you talking to a friend? Who are you talking to? And it's very interesting because healthcare providers often receive some training on these topics. However, not all of them are comfortable talking about this topic. So just because they might have heard about it, and there was actually a study done that suggested that PT students actually had really good knowledge about sex and disability, and that actual knowledge increased over time, but their discomfort for the topic also increased over time. So they actually got more knowledgeable and less able to have the conversation that they needed to have, which, in a way is like, well, that's kind of a head scratcher. But I think that what that ends up happening is that people then don't know who to initiate and how to talk to people and what to do. And so one of the models that's out there for healthcare is really this Plisit model. And I think that when we were talking about, well, is this something that anyone can use? We actually realized this actually could be a way to be thinking about having that conversation, whether you're talking to somebody new that you might be interested in sexually, a partner that you are trying to get back to more of a sexual life, more intimacy, or even to a healthcare provider. And so you can use the same kind of approach. And this model is really one that goes from this broad general topic to more detailed. And so if you think about this permission, it's really making sure that you have permission to talk about this, to bring this up in a very broad general way so that you can make sure that you're aware, are you talking to somebody who's comfortable with this? Are you not talking about? We could go into some details. The limited information is really how much, what are some details? How much do I know? How much do you know? What do we need to share? More specific is the how-tos. And I think a lot of what Corey and Kate presented is really some of the specific suggestions and how-tos. And then where do you get into intensive therapy? When do you need more help as you're moving through this? All right. And so Rosemary's going to really go through these and kind of talk about the first three, and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of when do you need more help.
And like Jeannie was saying, we were thinking, oh, well, everyone can use this. Especially think about permission. Opening up space for discussion about sexual health and concerns, and it's an active role. So you'll see examples here. The first one is the person with the spinal cord injury. I'm thinking more about wanting sexual intimacy again. Can we start talking about it? So she's opening the door to communication. It could be she's talking to the doctor, or it could be she's talking to the partner, but she's opened the door. And here with the partner, can we talk about how your spinal cord injury has impacted our sex life? Opening the door. So think about how that would affect you to give permission for conversations that might be difficult, or opening the door as a therapist or healthcare provider for patients routinely so that they know that you're approachable. With the healthcare provider to the person with the spinal cord injury, do you have any questions or concerns about sex? Pretty simple. And then we have to follow it up with the next parts of giving information. But permission, as we were, I was researching about this, permission really is best given over and over again. Just because you got permission once, don't assume. And so that people can tell you no. Because one answer is, no, I don't want to talk about that. But you can say, well, know that I am open to talking to you if you are. Talk to me, I'm willing to talk to you anytime. Give that permission. With limited information, you're providing basic information to give knowledge and to dispel misconceptions. Because as we talked about earlier, society gives a lot of messages about people being asexual if they have disabilities. You could include handouts or videos, and the examples here with the healthcare provider. The patient's asked about having sex, and they're going to hand out some resources or give some, and hopefully also talk about, draw the person out about what they were really wanting. And dispelling myths. Do I need contraception now that I'm not having an orgasm? Okay, a lot of people really need basic sex education. And you can provide some and then tell them where they can go for a more thorough dive into that. Some people have had no sex education, so don't assume because we're all adults that we know. And then, can I have penetration intercourse? That is the start of a discussion, so I'm going to give some limited information, but it's also, what about occupational therapy? As Corey was talking about, positioning and how to do these things. You're going to give more information to the patient as you find out what they need. Specific suggestions is just going with what the person needs, getting more specific, and how can I manage my spasticity during sex? What positions can we try that would feel good? So this would be try exploring your body to see what you can feel and enjoy, a handout that shows how to decrease your spasticity with positioning or doing range of motion before you're going to have sex, or taking medication and doing range of motion and positioning. So ongoing conversations with specific suggestions that the person can try is real helpful.
And I think that, when we're thinking about this, like, you would never lead with the specific suggestion before you got permission, right? Like, you wouldn't go to a partner and say, hey, I think we need to try this sex toy before you opened up the idea of, like, hey, I'm thinking about maybe we should explore some new ways of having sex, right? And then you might get to, like, I went to this great talk. Can we talk about this? As opposed to leading with, hey, I got a gift certificate. Let's go buy something, right? So you have to think about who your audience is, right? When it gets to intensive therapy, when do you need it? How do you ask for it? I think that there's a lot of people that don't even recognize where they're having trouble. And this is a great time to figure out where might you need help. And some of it may be due to libido, and you might need to see a physician. It might be depression, and you may need a psychologist or medication psychiatrist. Body image issues, again, this can be for several different people. It may be education, right? It may be talking to your occupational therapist or your physical therapist. It may be seeing a marriage therapist, things like that. And healthcare providers being able to reach out and say, this is really out of my scope of practice. Like, I don't really know enough to have these conversations, but here, let me connect you with the person who can have that conversation with you, because it's important, as opposed to shutting it down and moving it off the plate. So I think that's one of the things that you want to be clear on, is that there is that extra help if you need it, because it's really an important thing that we want to not have just shove under the rug.
Well, ultimately knowing what you want is key. And preparation it's going to be a little repetitive here, but it's important. Writing down what you long for sexually. Practice saying what you want out loud. Practice with a friend. Or just get yourself to go over it so you feel more comfortable and have less anxiety about getting on with your sex life. So you would write down what makes you anxious and go over that, and then give yourself permission to seek the assistance that you need. And Jeanne was just mentioning some. Some may be foreign to you, like marriage counseling or other things. I wish in our country we had surrogate services. They do in Canada. It's not illegal. So that where surrogate would be that you could hire someone and you could explore some of these sensory things. But unfortunately, that is not happening in our country yet. You need to learn about your body. And body mapping was referred to in the previous lecture, but you can learn about yourself. It's a body. It's an experience that you have of your own body, the shape, the size, plus how and where, how your joints move, and how your body functions. And sometimes people have an accurate body map, but after spinal cord injury, things have changed. So it can be helpful to do this mapping to inform you, the owner, of where stimulation feels good and what's needed to have an orgasm and so on. So mapping can be done through self-touch, and if you can't reach or do that, through other people touching you. And you can also use your mind and breath if you do not have the ability to do this touch. So when you're going to use your mind and breath, what's going on is I decide that it's my hand I'm going to focus on. I'm going to breathe. And it's better to breathe a little longer out than in, like a relaxation breath. Just breathe a few times. 1, 2, 3, 4 in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out. I'm focusing on my hand. I keep breathing and putting the energy with the out breath to the part of the body I'm focusing on. And when I'm done with that, and you decide, move on. And you can do their whole body this way. And it's an exploration of this body mapping. You could also go to a massage therapist and tell that person what you're trying to do and instruct them that you want to alternate between light stroke and firm stroke or whatever you think would help you map out your body. And this person's a professional, and so they will be able to assist you. People need to look at their genitals, and especially for women, I was really surprised as a nurse that a lot of women have never looked. So I really recommend, even if you have to, this would take a little bit of courage, ask somebody to hold the mirror for you, that you look at your genitals and or pictures of sexual anatomy, and get your vocabulary up to speed. Learn the names of the parts of the body and be able to use them.
So not just private parts and, all the other names that you use with your children, right? So I think, ultimately it's important that we think about kind of how do we think about spinal cord injury and whose job is it to talk about sex and sexuality, and how do you talk about intimacy? And it really is like I think about it as the whole rehab team. And I have some of my rehab team people here. And honestly, it's stuff we talk about of like, how do you get people back out into their lives, and their sexual lives are part of their lives. And so all these different people on the screen are all folks that can be helpful and that can be useful in terms of thinking about how to have these conversations. They can help with their conversations with your partner. They can help with conversations with another healthcare provider, or they can direct you to the kind of people that you need. And ultimately, it's really, even with communication, we think about communication as being part of the whole sexual experience. We have a lot of issues that come up about that need to be communicated with somebody else, and I think that we tend to forget about how do we use our resources around us. A lot of people end up just choosing not to be engaged in intimate relationships or sexual relationships because they just don't know where to start, or they feel uncomfortable with their body, or they don't know how to deal with how do I manage my clothing, and how do I deal with bowel and bladder? Like, it's just easier not to think about it. But it always is something that can come back up again. It can always be brought up again. It can always be raised as an issue. And I think that communication is just such a key part of that. So that even starting those conversations about, I'm thinking about this. this is an idea I had. I mean, to be able to go and say, hey, I just went to this talk and, this is making me wonder about maybe something I might want to do. And whether that, again, is with a partner or somebody, a friend, or even a healthcare provider, we really want to encourage that. Did you have anything else on this one?
Well, I don't know. I think people, when they come to the clinic, they may not be thinking, I can bring up this as a valid concern that needs to be worked on. And when it comes to managing bowel and bladder, really, we can help with that. Incontinence should not be something you're worrying about with getting into a sexual experience, but also want to put out the message that you can start where you're comfortable, because sexuality is a long spectrum. So maybe just having the courage to say, I'm attracted to you, and I wonder if we could go do something together, or I'm thinking about how nice it would be to kiss you. What are you thinking? Just getting some courage up to put that into practice doesn't involve that whole other list that we were talking about, and can decrease the anxiety, because just holding someone's hand might be a big step if you're not, or having them put their hand on yours, if you're not doing anything yet. So I would want to encourage people to start that where they feel comfortable, and then build on top.
When we were talking about this topic early on with our group, one of the comments that I made was, sometimes it's successive approximations, right? That, maybe you're not jumping to having sex at the front end of your relationship, but really it's like, how do you begin to have somebody touch you? How do you begin to hold hands? How do you begin to have that kind of close relationship, and even think about getting close to having some sort of sexual experience with them? And it's really like moving along in successive approximations closer and closer to the thing that you want to get to. And I think that, for all of us, whether you're working with people with spinal cord injury, stumbling my words, whether you have a spinal cord injury, whether you're a partner of somebody, I think getting comfortable with the topic is a great place to start. Are you comfortable with your own sexuality? Do you have in your own head what you like, what you don't like, what's important to you? What are the political views? What are the cultural views? What are the religious views that you bring to the table? I think is really important to be clear on that, because that may or may not have an impact on how you can talk to somebody else. Can you be not judgmental? If somebody believes something different than you, if they like to do things that you're not comfortable with, can you be non-judgmental and still have a conversation about it? Are you open and willing to learn? Because just because it's foreign to you doesn't necessarily mean that it's not something you may not be interested in. It may just be weird to hear about it at first. And so being open to those ideas are really important.
Well, I think on this one, you've said pretty much what we need to talk about. I would really, this is kind of odd, but can I go back to make a pitch for masturbation? Because I got all jumbled up in that part of this presentation. Because really, when you think about it, this is a really great way to learn what kind of stimulation you need, where you have feeling, where you don't, so what turns you on, because then you can educate someone else, and then you have more facts about the matter. And as Betty Dodson, Sex for One is a book I brought because it's not focused on disabled people, it's focused on that it's healthy, the healthy and goodness of masturbation. And she has a quote in there which now I can't say correctly, but it's the lifelong thing you can do, right? And most, actually in research, most kids do genital touch, and most people, as they're growing up, have some kind of exposure to this with others. But let's take it out of the shame closet and put it in as one of those things that can really help you do this body mapping. And there's more information about the brain, body mapping, and the breath, because I didn't say this, but breath is a wonderful way to connect with what's going on in your body. So those are things that if you want more information about that, you can contact me and I can get it to you. Thank you.
And I also think that you have to keep in mind, like, not everybody has great hand function or great sensation or things like that. And I think that, when you're thinking about connecting, it may be through images, it may be through just your thinking, like doing some imagery, and those kind of things can allow you to have sexual experiences by yourself, even if you don't have a partner that you're working with. Because what we know is that once you've had a spinal cord injury and your sensation changes, that what your experience is changes. And so the only way to figure out what feels good or doesn't feel good is by trying things out. And if you can't try a lot of things out by yourself, what you can do is look for things that stimulate you and stimulate your mind in a sexual way. Because really, as much as people hate me saying it, is that most sex happens here. It happens between your ears. Whether you're enjoying it, whether you're not enjoying it, it's all about what's happening in your head. And so you can enjoy that whether or not your body's working well for you or it's not working well for you. No matter if you can get in the right position or get the right toy or whatever. So it's important to keep in mind.
And there, with that idea, I want to encourage giving permission. Let your mind go where it wants to go on this. That's something that people often don't do. They edit, they say, oh, I can't think about that. Oh, that's not right. Just try liberating your mind to think about these things and then see what kind of response that same mind has for you. Because, and the last thing is, if the person you want to be intimate with they won't know anything about spinal cord injury. Keep that in mind and give them permission. Make sure to give them permission to ask you questions about your body.
So I just want to end with just some resources. And again, these will be available on the website if you want to look at them. There's some great sites online at this point that have a lot of information. And I think Corey also had a list of other sites as well. I also do want to highlight some of the videos that we've done in the past several years where a lot of these topics have come up. I started by thinking, I'll pull out a few clips here and there. And then I was like, well, we just could watch the whole video. So I encourage you to look at these because I think some of the issues that you're bringing up, the communication in dating and relationships, really about people trying to begin to talk about that. How do you think about having sex for the first time? What do people need to know about spinal cord injury? What do you need to know about them? We did had a presentation from the folks at Babeland with very specific toys and suggestions quite a number of years ago. So none of the cool new stuff that Corey was sharing earlier. There's also Love and Marriage After Spinal Cord Injury, Conversations from the Bedroom, that has really kind of frank, open discussion about, things like worries about autonomic dysreflexia happening when you're having orgasm, things like that you need to be careful of. So definitely use these resources and check out these videos if you want more. At this point, we have a few more minutes, and I wanted to definitely leave time. So if there's any questions, we're happy to answer them. But that's kind of the end of our presentation for today. Right. So I think everybody heard the question of really how do you begin? Like it all starts like with you, obviously. If you don't feel like you're a sexual being, it's really hard to have anybody else view you as being sexual as well. And I think that, as a psychologist, when we work with people who are struggling with kind of all of these issues, and it can come in many forms, right? It can come in body image issues, it can come in role change issues, it can come in, many different shapes and sizes. And I think really what we're trying to figure out is kind of what is the self-talk that's going on in your own head? What are the things that you're saying to yourself or thinking about yourself? Because a lot of people forget that they had all these views, all these ideas about sex and disability before they were ever injured. They might have seen somebody and thought of them as being asexual, and so now they're having to project that on themselves. And until you really discover where your thoughts are and how you're thinking about yourself, it's hard to move forward. It's hard to do the practice of that.
Yes, and when you need care, there's a cascade people can get into in looking at that if you need care, you're like a child. This is one of the bases for labeling people asexual. And so what Jeannie's saying is really important, and there are some free ways to work on your mind and what you're thinking and get a grasp on how some of the messages you're giving yourself are not at all helpful, and develop some positive, accurate things that you say to yourself. And this book, this course, Living a Healthy Life with Chronic Health Problems, is one that's free and most available like through Kaiser and other insurances.
And if you have a spinal cord injury, we are doing an online peer-led version of that, but a much more targeted one. But this could be a great goal to work on, right, Lan? This could be a perfect topic to work on. And if you're interested, let us know, because we'll be starting the group probably in October. Thanks for that plug, Rosemary.
Yes, because of course the Thrive, our course for people with, specifically for people with spinal cord injury, is going to be great and is great. This, but I wanted to mention this because I didn't know we were getting ours going again,
Yeah.
so I'm thrilled. Yay. Also, there's some other books over there. I do think for some people, reading's helpful and gets over some of the anxiety or know about, like, say, masturbation.
This is one of those things, right? As a psychologist, I get to do all sorts of fun things. Like, I had somebody who was so embarrassed to talk about her bowel function, and she needed to talk about masturbation. She wanted to talk about orgasm, but she couldn't even get there. And so, like, I had her say, like, poop, poop, poop in session like 10 times in a row. And she was like, I can't do it. It's like it probably took her 30 minutes to say it 10 times. And then she came the next time, and I'm like, all right, we're going to start with this again. And, I'm sure people who were in the hallways probably were like, oh my God, what is Jeannie up to today? But it was one of those things like, she couldn't even bring up the topic of figuring out what her body felt like and how she might be able to, gosh, could she use a vibrator again? Was that even something she could try? Because she couldn't even begin to have the basic discussions. And so, I think this is where you get to, is like you have to get to a starting point of where it's comfortable. And again, looking online, reading things, all of that are great starts for this. Again, I didn't start with this when I was in graduate school. I swear to God, I was like, if somebody would have said, you're going to be up there talking about sex all the time, I would have said they were crazy. But here we are.
And I think it's helpful, if you can, to think about informing your healthcare provider that you're going to see, whether it's the nurse, the doctor, whoever, that you want to talk about sex and you want to talk about XYZ about it. If you are comfortable with that and can do it ahead of time, to allow them to know that you want to get into that and prepare properly for talking to you. And so, like you said, you knew your brain was fine. You were thinking the thoughts, it's all connected, but nothing's connected in the area of sex and your genitals and what's going on down there, getting an erection, all that, or feeling. So what's going to happen? What's your future, right? So if that's what you want to talk about, think about informing the person you're seeing that that's what you want to talk about. Because I think you give them an opportunity to get their act together and be able to address what you want to talk about.
Yeah, with that same asking them that.
Yeah.
And this is one thing about, you're going to be, often when you start talking about sex, you're going to need to keep talking about it.
Right.
You're going to, if you're going to try a piece of equipment, I'll make something up, like the vacuum device, and see if that's going to work for you, or you're trying some pills and your mind, and masturbation, and you're going to see how that's going to work, then you're going to have to talk again, right? So give yourself permission, and also keep at it, and expect to see the doctor or nurse, whoever you're working with, psychologist, frequently for a while, so you can get to your goal.